The weight of silence filled our favorite restaurant as I sat alone, checking my watch for the 20th time. Our 15th anniversary dinner, the one I'd planned for weeks between court appearances and client meetings, and David was nowhere to be found. I smiled weakly at the waiter who refilled my water glass, his eyes filled with that unmistakable pity reserved for people being stood up. My calls went straight to voicemail. The champagne remained unopened, the candle burned lower, and that hollowness in my chest grew with each passing minute. After 2 hours, I finally admitted defeat. I drove home in silence, the small velvet jewelry box on the passenger seat mocking me. The house was dark when I arrived. No note on the counter, no missed calls explaining his absence. Just emptiness and the echo of my heels against the hardwood floors. I stood in our kitchen, surrounded by the expensive appliances we rarely use together anymore, wondering how the most important day of our year had shattered so completely. Had there been signs? Had he said something this morning that I'd missed while answering emails? I slipped off my carefully selected dress, the one I knew was his favorite, and changed into sweatpants. The bed felt enormous without him, the silence of our Chicago brownstone deafening as I scrolled through my phone, checking texts and emails for any clue. Nothing. My husband of 15 years had vanished on the very night meant to celebrate our love, and I had absolutely no idea why. If I'm being honest, the distance between us hadn't appeared overnight. It had grown slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a crack in a foundation that starts small but eventually threatens the entire structure. My law career had flourished, senior associate to junior partner to being on track for named partner, while our marriage withered in the shadow of my success. How many times had David mentioned his art exhibition, only for me to miss it because of a last-minute client emergency? How many anniversary trips had we postponed because I couldn't possibly step away from a case? I'd convinced myself that my success was for us, for our future. But somewhere along the way, us had become me, and David had become a ghost in our home, moving quietly through rooms, careful not to disturb my important work. The night before our anniversary, had I even looked up from my laptop when he placed a cup of tea beside me? Did I notice the way his hand lingered on my shoulder, waiting for acknowledgement that never came? I'd grown so accustomed to his patience, his understanding, his willingness to bend around my schedule that I'd stopped seeing him at all. Our conversations had become transactional. Who would pick up dry cleaning, whether bills had been paid, what time I'd be home if at all. The wall of legal books in my home office had become more familiar than the lines of my husband's face. When was the last time we'd actually looked at each other? Really looked? When had I last asked about his dreams instead of recounting my victories? The truth stared back at me in the bathroom mirror at 3 a.m. I couldn't remember. I found the letter the next morning, placed carefully on his pillow. I'd missed it in the darkness of the previous night. My hands trembled as I unfolded the thick stationery, the expensive paper I'd given him for Christmas that he used for special projects. "Evelyn," it began, "by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Not forever, maybe, but for now. 15 years ago, I married a woman who looked at me like I hung the moon, who would cancel meetings to spend Sunday mornings tangled in bedsheets with me, who valued our connection above everything else. I've spent the last 5 years becoming invisible to that same woman." My breath caught as his words cut through me. "I've been screaming silently for years, but you were too busy to hear me. I stopped painting the day you missed my first major gallery opening, the one you promised you wouldn't miss for the world." The world, it turned out, was a client whose name you've mentioned more often than mine these past years. Tears blurred my vision as I continued reading, his handwriting growing less steady toward the end. "I've tried, Evelyn. I've scheduled dates you've canceled, planned trips you've postponed, left notes you've never mentioned finding. I can count on one hand the dinners we've had together this past month. I'm staying at Ryan's for now. I need time to decide if there's anything left to save, or if we've both become too different from the people who made those promises 15 years ago. I need to know if you even notice I'm gone." It wasn't signed with love or even his name, just emptiness where his affection used to be. I clutched the letter to my chest and finally allowed myself to cry, the sound of my sobs echoing in the home that suddenly felt like a stranger's. The evidence of our disintegration was everywhere once I started looking. While searching for clues about where David might have gone longer term, I discovered his journal in his studio, the one room in our house I rarely entered anymore. The leather-bound book fell open naturally to entries from 3 years earlier. "Evelyn canceled our anniversary trip again today. Said the Robertson case couldn't wait." I pretended to understand, but I'm writing this from the hotel room I'd booked anyway. Sitting alone watching the sunset, that should have been ours. Page after page documented moments I'd missed, promises broken, disappointment swallowed. I found receipts for couples therapy consultations he'd gone to alone, the therapist's notes suggesting he consider whether he's willing to remain in a one-person marriage. Most devastating were the voice recordings on his phone, conversations he'd practiced having with me. "Evelyn, I need you to hear me. I'm drowning in your absence even when you're here." His voice broke on the recording. "I don't want to be just an obligation you check off your list between meetings." These weren't recent. They spanned years. Years of him trying to reach me while I climbed higher in my career, collecting accolades and bonuses that now seemed worthless. Finding his browser history revealed searches like "when to know your marriage is over" and "living alone after long marriage." In our shared cloud storage were folders of photos, hundreds cataloging our early years, then fewer and fewer as time passed, until the last 2 years showed mostly empty spaces where we should have been together. The final folder, labeled simply "Last Chances," contained pictures of notes he'd left me that I'd never acknowledged, dinners he'd prepared that had gone cold, and events he'd attended alone with an empty seat beside him. I'd been blind to a slow-motion collapse that had been happening right before my eyes. The house revealed more truths as I wandered through it that weekend, really seeing our shared space for the first time in years. In David's studio, canvases were stacked against the wall, covered in dust. The last vibrantly colored painting was dated 3 years ago, exactly when I'd made junior partner. Everything after showed progressively darker palettes, abstract forms that seemed to be reaching across empty spaces, but never connecting. His workspace was meticulously organized, as though preserved rather than used. On his desk sat anniversary gifts from previous years, some still in their wrapping paper with cards attached. "Year 12. Maybe we can use these concert tickets when your case settles." We never did. I found our calendar hanging in the kitchen with important dates meticulously marked. My birthday circled with notes about gifts he'd planned, work events where he'd intended to support me, his own exhibitions with hopeful question marks next to my name. Most heartbreaking was discovering the guest room bed showed signs of frequent use. Pillows indented, a book on the nightstand, his reading glasses folded neatly beside them. How long had he been sleeping there instead of beside me? His closet revealed clothes I'd never seen him wear, suggesting a life lived increasingly separate from mine. In the living room, our wedding photo had been placed face down, while next to it stood pictures of him with friends I barely recognized. A partially packed suitcase sat in the corner of his closet. Had he been planning this departure for weeks? The refrigerator held prepared meals with dates and reheating instructions labeled in his handwriting. Even knowing he might leave, he'd still made sure I would eat properly in his absence. His care for me had never wavered, even as my attention to him had evaporated completely. I faced myself in the bathroom mirror, really looking at the woman my husband had left behind. My expensive haircut, the tailored clothes, the subtle makeup that projected confidence in the courtroom, all carefully cultivated for professional success, none of it mattering now. "You look terrible," said my best friend Jamie when she arrived after my desperate call. "Did you really not see this coming?" Her question hung between us as we sat in my immaculate kitchen that never showed signs of home-cooked meals shared together. "I thought we were fine," I whispered. He understood my career demands. Jamie's laugh was hollow. Did he understand, or did he just stop telling you how he felt because you weren't listening? When I showed her the letter, she wasn't surprised. He told me months ago he was at his breaking point. My head snapped up. "He talked to you about us?" She nodded slowly. "He needed someone to talk to, Ev. You weren't exactly available." Her words stung with truth. The awards and recognition that line my home office shelves suddenly seemed like monuments to my failure rather than success. Our wedding photo lay face down while my Attorney of the Year plaque stood prominently displayed. What good was being the best lawyer in Chicago if I'd failed so completely at being a partner to the one person who mattered most? That night, I tried calling David. His response was a simple text: "I need space. Please respect that." For years ago, he would have answered on the first ring, eager to hear my voice. Now, 8 words of digital text were all he could offer. I realized with sickening clarity that professional success, without him to share it with, was the hollowest of victories. My sister Nora arrived unannounced the following day, letting herself in with the emergency key. She found me still in pajamas at 2 p.m., surrounded by photo albums and David's journals. "This isn't going to help," she said, closing the albums and pulling me to my feet. "You need to hear some hard truths." Over coffee, she refused to let me wallow. "Everyone saw this coming except you, Evelyn. At Christmas, Mom asked me if you two were having problems because you barely spoke to each other. At your firm's summer party, David stood alone by the bar for an hour while you networked." Each example landed like a physical blow. "Why didn't anyone say anything?" I asked, my voice small. "We tried," she replied. "You always had a perfect explanation. You were building a future. It was temporary pressure." David understood. She reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of self-help books, all with highlighted passages and notes in the margins. "David came to me 6 months ago, asking for advice. These are the books he's been reading, trying to figure out how to reach you." I leafed through them, seeing titles like Emotional Neglect in Marriage and When Your Partner is Present but Absent. His neat handwriting filled the margins, questions, reflections, desperate strategies to reconnect with me. One note particularly gutted me. "Try again. One last time. Anniversary dinner, 15 years. If she doesn't show up for this, I can't keep pretending we still exist." My eyes filled with tears. "I was there," I whispered. "But he wasn't." Nora took my hand. "Because for 15 years, you've been partially there while he's been fully present. He finally reached his limit." I called my firm the next morning and did something unprecedented. I requested emergency leave. "The Robertson case goes to court in 3 weeks, my boss reminded me, his voice sharp with disapproval. "If you step back now, I can't guarantee your position on the partner track will be secure." 2 weeks ago, Those words would have terrified me into immediate compliance. Today, they barely registered. My marriage is falling apart, I said simply. Nothing else matters right now. The silence on the line spoke volumes. He'd never heard me prioritize anything above work. Take 3 days, he finally offered. Not enough, I countered. I need 2 weeks minimum. Reassign the Robertson case if necessary. I could practically hear his shock through the phone. Evelyn, you've worked toward partner for 7 years. This is career suicide. I looked at David's letter, still on the kitchen counter. No, I replied. This is me finally making the right choice. After hanging up, I felt simultaneously terrified and liberated. For the first time in years, I wasn't letting work dictate my life's parameters. I spent that afternoon writing my own letter to David. No legal terminology, no carefully constructed arguments, just raw truth. I've been blind, I wrote. Not just to your pain, but to what really matters. I won't make excuses for how I failed us. I could list all the ways I plan to change, but you deserve actions, not promises. I continued pouring my heart onto the page, taking full responsibility, without qualifications. I don't expect forgiveness. I only ask for the chance to show you who I can be, who I should have been all along. I drove to his brother Ryan's house across town and left the letter in their mailbox, resisting the urge to demand a response. This wasn't the negotiation. It was the beginning of atonement. The waiting nearly broke me. Days passed with no word from David while I rattled around our empty house, the silence deafening. I'd become so accustomed to filling every moment with work that sitting with my thoughts was excruciating. I'd reach for my laptop, then force my hands away, reminding myself that this compulsion was exactly what had created the chasm between us. Instead, I did something that had become foreign. I reflected. I found our old photo albums, videos from vacations in those early, magic years. There we were in Barcelona, David feeding me paella, and laughing when I spilled wine on my dress. In another, hiking in Colorado, my hair wild in the mountain wind as he looked at me with such naked adoration it made my current self weep with loss. When had I stopped noticing that look? When had I stopped earning it? Each buzz of my phone sent my heart racing. Was it him? More often it was work, increasingly desperate emails about cases I'd abandoned. I let them pile up unanswered. On day 5, my phone rang with Ryan's number. I answered immediately, my voice embarrassingly eager. He read your letter, Ryan said, his tone carefully neutral. He needs more time, Evelyn. But he did read it. This tiny crumb of hope was enough to sustain me. Tell him I'm here, I said. Tell him I'll wait. After the call, I wandered into his studio and sat among his abandoned canvases, running my fingers over dried paint strokes, trying to reconnect with the man who had created them. For the first time in years, I gave myself permission to do absolutely nothing but feel the painful consequences of my choices. Changes don't happen overnight, but they do happen through deliberate choices made day after day. I found a therapist specializing in workaholism and marital neglect. Dr. Patterson didn't sugarcoat her assessment after our first session. You've been emotionally unavailable for years, she told me. Your husband has been in a relationship alone, and you need to recognize that damage can't be undone with grand gestures or temporary changes. I'd never been so thoroughly confronted with my failings, but I kept returning twice weekly, determined to understand the patterns that had led me here. I began clearing out my home office, which had gradually consumed more of our living space over the years. I boxed up legal texts, removed the second monitor, and dismantled the standing desk that had allowed me to work through meals. In its place, I created a sitting area with two comfortable chairs facing each other, an invitation to conversation that had been absent too long. The most difficult call was to my managing partner, declining the partnership offer I'd been pursuing relentlessly. "I'm restructuring my priorities," I explained to his stunned silence. "I'll continue with the firm, but not at partnership-level commitment." My colleagues thought I'd lost my mind, but for the first time in years, my decisions weren't guided by career advancement. I started learning about David's art world, reading books about his favorite painters, understanding techniques he'd mentioned in passing that I'd never bothered to explore. I visited galleries he'd exhibited in, seeing his work through others' appreciative eyes. I was laying groundwork for a life rebalanced, though I had no guarantee he'd ever return to share it. 3 weeks after he left, David texted, "Can we meet?" The park bench where I proposed. "Tomorrow at noon." Those few words sent my heart racing. I arrived 30 minutes early, absurdly nervous, as if meeting a stranger for a first date rather than my husband of 15 years. When he appeared on the path, my breath caught. He looked both familiar and unknown, the man I'd married, but with new edges I hadn't bothered to discover forming over the years. We sat with uncomfortable space between us, the spring sunlight dappling through oak leaves overhead. "You look different," he finally said. I nodded. "I'm trying to be different. Or maybe just find my way back to who I was before I lost sight of what matters." He studied me carefully. "I got your letter. And Ryan says you've been calling his house every 3 days, exactly at 6 p.m., not pushing, just checking in." This methodical restraint was so unlike my usual approach to problems. Identify target, pursue aggressively, win at all costs. "I'm giving you space," I said, while trying to show I'm still here. His eyes, those warm brown eyes that once looked at me with such devotion, held caution now. "I spent years trying to get your attention, Evelyn. Years dropping hints, having conversations you don't remember, waiting for you to notice me drowning." I resisted my lawyer's instinct to defend, to contextualize, to redirect. Instead, I simply listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time in years. When he finished speaking, he sighed deeply. "I don't know what happens next, but I'm willing to meet like this once a week. Small steps." It wasn't forgiveness or reconciliation, but it was something I hadn't earned yet, opportunity. Our first therapy session together a week later stripped away any illusions I had about quick fixes. "David feels fundamentally unseen in this marriage," Dr. Patterson stated plainly, as we sat across from each other. "And Evelyn, your pattern of prioritizing work over relationship has created deep-rooted trust issues. He doesn't believe your current attention will last." David nodded, eyes down. "Every time you've promised changes before, they've lasted maybe 2 weeks. Then it's back to just this one important case, or after this big deadline." The therapist gave us communication exercises that felt awkward and artificial at first. I had to paraphrase David's feelings before responding, had to wait a full minute after he spoke before replying. For someone used to rapid-fire courtroom exchanges, this deliberate slowness was excruciating. But it revealed how often I'd been formulating responses instead of truly listening, how frequently I'd dismissed his concerns with practiced reassurances. The breakthrough came during our third session when David described a night last year when he'd been sick with fever. "I was shivering so badly the bed shook. You came in around midnight from work, asked if I needed anything, put some water by the bed, then went to your office to finish preparing for court. You never checked on me again." As I listened, really visualizing the scene from his perspective, something broke open in my chest. "You were alone when you needed me most," I whispered, finally understanding. "Not just that night, but for years. I've been the loneliest with you sitting right beside me, looking through me to your next achievement." 6 weeks into our cautious reconnection, a crisis erupted at work. The Robertson case, the one I'd stepped back from, was collapsing without my involvement. My phone rang continuously through dinner with David, our first attempt at cooking together in our own kitchen. With each buzz, I saw him tense, waiting for me to choose work again. When the managing partner himself called, David's face fell. "You should take it," he said quietly, already pulling away emotionally, preparing for the familiar disappointment. My hand hovered over the phone, the old pull nearly irresistible. This case could save or sink my career. The firm had been explicit about the consequences of my stepped-back role. For a moment, I was right back in my old patterns, calculating how to minimize damage with David while still handling the work emergency. Then I saw it, the minute shift in his posture, the resigned look I'd never noticed before. He was already preparing for my absence, while sitting right across from me. I silenced the phone and placed its screen down on the counter. "No," I said firmly. "We had plans." His surprise was heartbreaking. Such a small act of prioritization shouldn't have been so unexpected. The dinner was imperfect, slightly awkward, but wholly ours. Later that night, as we sat on opposite ends of the sofa, he finally voiced his doubt. "I want to believe this is real change, Evelyn, but I've seen this movie before. As soon as I let myself trust it, you'll be pulled back into 60-hour weeks and middle-of-the-night phone calls." His honesty hurt, but we needed these raw truths. "I can't promise I'll never work late again," I admitted. "But I can promise you'll never again be an afterthought in my life." I found the memory box while cleaning out our storage closet, a beautiful wooden chest I'd never seen before. Inside were hundreds of mementos from our relationship, movie ticket stubs from our first date, the cork from our wedding champagne, dried flowers from anniversaries, handwritten notes I'd left him during our early years. "Meeting running late, but can't wait to hold you tonight. You're the best part of my day." When had I stopped writing such notes? When had appreciation been replaced by expectation? There were hospital bracelets from when I'd had appendicitis and he'd stayed by my bed for 3 days straight. Birthday cards where I'd written specific, loving things I admired about him. As the items grew more current, my contributions became scarcer. Gift cards with hasty signatures, generic cards signed without personalization. Meanwhile, his efforts remained consistent. Thoughtful letters, small gifts left by my bedside that I barely acknowledged. The most recent item was dated just 2 months ago, a handwritten invitation to a weekend away that I declined for a deposition preparation. I gathered these artifacts and created a timeline on our dining room table, the visual representation of our relationship's slow erosion. When David came for our scheduled dinner that Friday, I showed him what I discovered. "I want to understand what happened to us," I explained. "And I can see it now, you never stopped trying. I just stopped noticing." His eyes glistened as he touched a concert ticket from years ago. "I kept everything," he said softly. "I needed evidence that we were real once, that I hadn't imagined how good we were together." For the first time since he'd left, he reached for my hand across the table. A tiny bridge spanning the canyon between us. 2 months after David walked out, I made the decision that would have been unthinkable to my former self. I met with the partners and formally withdrew from partnership consideration, instead proposing a radical restructuring of my role, reduced hours, selective case acceptance, and a junior associate to handle overflow. You're making a serious mistake, the managing partner warned. No one walks away from this opportunity. I thought of David sitting alone at his gallery opening while I negotiated with clients across town. Actually, I'm correcting a serious mistake, I replied. When I told David about my decision during our walk through the lakefront park, his reaction wasn't what I expected. Did you do this for me or for yourself? He asked cautiously. The question caught me off guard. The old me would have immediately claimed it was for him, leveraging the sacrifice. But months of therapy had taught me something about honesty. Both, I admitted. I was miserable and didn't know it. Successful but hollow. I want a career that allows me to be present in my life, not just passing through it. He nodded slowly. That's the first answer that actually gives me hope. Some friends were openly critical of my choice. My law school classmate Charlotte called it setting feminism back 30 years. But my sister Nora understood. It's not about working less, she observed over coffee. It's about choosing a life where success includes love, not just achievement. That weekend, when David suggested he might bring some clothes back to the house, not moving back, just a tentative step, I realized no courtroom victory had ever felt this significant. The first time David kissed me again felt like both remembrance and discovery. We'd been meeting regularly for 2 months, gradually rebuilding trust through small, consistent actions. I'd maintained my boundaries with work, been present for our scheduled times together, and learned to listen without defensiveness. He'd begun sharing his thoughts again, tentatively at first, then with increasing openness. We were walking along Lake Michigan, the summer evening perfect with a gentle breeze, when he stopped mid-sentence and looked at me intently. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, he admitted. For a call from your office to pull you away, for the old patterns to return. I met his gaze steadily. I can't promise perfection, but I can promise priority. Something shifted in his expression, and he leaned forward, his lips meeting mine with a hesitancy that broke my heart. This man who once couldn't keep his hands off me now approaching with such caution. The kiss deepened, and I felt tears on my cheeks, though whether they were his or mine, I couldn't tell. That weekend, he suggested we revisit the small beach cottage in Michigan where we'd spent our honeymoon. The symbolism wasn't subtle, but it felt right. We walked the same shores, but with new awareness of how easily love can erode when taken for granted. In the evening, sitting on the porch watching the sunset, David took my hand. I want to try dating again, he said quietly. Not picking up where we left off, but starting fresh. Learning who we are now. It wasn't full reconciliation, but it was infinitely more than I deserved. It was possibility. The test came 4 months after David had moved back home. A high-profile class action suit, exactly the kind of career-defining case I would have unhesitatingly thrown myself into before, landed on my desk. The managing partner made it clear this was my chance to redeem myself professionally after my unfortunate personal detour. I brought the case files home and spread them across the dining table, then asked David to sit with me. This is a big opportunity, I explained. The kind that would have consumed me completely before. I want us to decide together how to handle it. His surprise at being consulted was evident. You're asking me if you should take the case? I shook my head. I'm asking us to establish boundaries together. I'll take the case regardless. It's important work for families who've been harmed. But we need agreements about hours, communication, and protected time. For the next hour, we negotiated terms that would have seemed unimaginable to my workaholic self. No work on Sundays, home by 7 p.m., 3 nights minimum per week, agreement to bring in additional counsel if the case expanded beyond our boundaries. And I want to understand what you're working on, David added. Not just big case, but why it matters to you. This simple request illuminated how little I'd shared my passion for law with him, not just my ambition. When the case went to trial 3 months later, David sat in the courtroom for key testimony. Watching him listen attentively as I delivered my closing argument, I realized I could have both meaningful work and meaningful connection, but only with intentionality and clear priorities. We chose our first anniversary after reconciliation for a private vow renewal. No guests, no elaborate ceremony, just the two of us on the rooftop garden of our brownstone at sunset. I'd spent weeks writing new vows that weren't pretty platitudes but specific commitments I could actually keep. I promised to put my phone away during dinner. I read from the card in my shaking hands. I promise to ask about your day and really listen to the answer. I promise that no client will ever be more important than being by your side when you need me. David's eyes glistened as he held his own cards. I promise to tell you when I'm feeling invisible instead of withdrawing. I promise to celebrate your successes without resentment. I promise to remember that love requires both truth and grace. We exchanged simple bands to wear alongside our original wedding rings. Physical reminders of this second beginning. The most powerful moment came afterward, when David pulled the original goodbye letter from his pocket. I've been carrying this with me, he admitted. Part of me afraid I'd need it again. Together we lit the corner of the paper and watched it burn in our fire pit, the ashes scattering in the evening breeze. It wasn't magical healing. We both knew reconciliation was ongoing work rather than a destination. But as David pulled me close under the emerging stars, I felt something that had been missing for too long: presence. Not just physical proximity, but true emotional togetherness. We almost lost this, he whispered against my hair. I nodded, holding him tighter. Never again. A year after David walked out, our life had found a new rhythm, imperfect but intentional. I'd built a successful practice focusing on fewer, more meaningful cases, while creating firm boundaries around my time. David's art had flourished again, his newest collection featuring vibrant colors and interconnected forms that critics praised for their intimate optimism. We'd learned to navigate conflicts differently, no more silent withdrawals or working late to avoid difficult conversations. When I found myself slipping into old patterns during a demanding trial, David didn't silently suffer. He pointed it out directly. You've canceled dinner 3 nights this week, he said one evening. We need to recalibrate. The old me would have defensively listed the importance of what I was working on. Instead, I recognized the warning sign and adjusted my approach to the case. Most surprisingly, I'd found greater professional satisfaction in my more balanced life. By focusing deeply on select cases rather than spreading myself across too many clients, my work had actually improved. My relationship with colleagues had transformed too. No longer the driven partner-track attorney who intimidated associates, I'd become someone who modeled sustainable success. Our home reflected these changes. David's art hung prominently throughout the house, my legal awards balanced by photographs of our weekend adventures. The guest room had returned to its original purpose, no longer a refuge from marital disconnect. We'd even begun discussing possibilities we'd abandoned years earlier. Travel sabbaticals, perhaps even starting a family, though at 42, I wasn't sure what that might look like for us. What mattered was that we were planning a future together again. On our 16th anniversary, We returned to the restaurant where I'd sat alone a year earlier. This time, both chairs were filled. Between courses, we exchanged new letters, not apologies or promises this time, but reflections on our journey. A year ago tonight, I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. I wrote, I was right about what mattered, but wrong about having lost it. You gave me the chance to discover what real success looks like, a balanced life with you at its center. David's letter acknowledged his own role in our breakdown. I retreated into martyrdom instead of fighting for us. I let resentment build instead of demanding the connection we both deserved. The waiter who had witnessed my lonely vigil the previous year smiled as he brought champagne, celebrating something special. I looked at my husband. This man I nearly lost through years of neglect. This relationship I nearly sacrificed on the altar of professional ambition. A second chance, I replied simply. Later that night, curled together in our bed, David traced patterns on my shoulder. Do you ever regret stepping back from partnership? He asked quietly. I thought about the corner office I'd given up, the prestige, the income. Then I looked at the man beside me, at the life we'd rebuilt from broken pieces. Not for a single moment, I answered truthfully. Sometimes things must completely break before you can rebuild them stronger. Sometimes you have to nearly lose everything to recognize what truly matters. If you're watching this and something feels off in your relationship, don't wait for a letter to wake you up. The person you love might be silently screaming for connection while you're busy with what seems important now but won't matter in the end. Like this video if it resonated with you. Subscribe for more stories that might just change your perspective, and share with someone who needs to hear this before it's too late. What would you have done in Evelyn's shoes? Leave your thoughts in the comments below.